Hello and welcome to our webinar, Advocating for Underserved Populations. I am Tyson Avan, Advocate Support Program Manager, and presenting with me is Marae Banks, our new Underserved Population Support Advocate. Before I start off the whole presentation part, I want to give a brief overview of what Standpoint is for those joining who aren't familiar with our services. So Standpoint is a team of attorneys and advocates. We serve domestic, sexual, trafficking survivors, and professional violence who work with survivors with legal and advocacy questions in the state of Minnesota. We have an action line that takes calls Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. We also provide trainings upon request, have monthly webinars, such as this one, for advocates on various topics that will benefit advocates in their work. And we also put on our annual new laws training. We do about 6 every year, and we travel throughout the state of Minnesota. We just concluded the 2018 new laws for this year. Currently, right now, on staff, we have 5 attorneys specializing in areas of the law such as family, immigration, criminal, employment, OFP, HRO, custody, torts, and Title IX. So that is, in a gist, what we do here at Standpoint. And before I have Marae introduce herself and her position and what she is hoping to do with all of the advocates in the state of Minnesota. There are a couple of poll questions that I want to have you guys answer. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to answer, not a couple of minutes, a couple of seconds to answer the questions, and I'll share the results. And the results of the poll questions will actually help Marae in the rest of this webinar and also the work that she is planning on doing. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and launch the first question. And the first question is, do you work primarily in urban or rural areas? So go ahead and answer that question. And I'll close it when I see that almost everyone has answered. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it. And the results. So the results are 50% work in urban areas and 50% work in the rural areas. Okay. And the next question is, do you primarily work with a specific underserved population? Yes or no? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close that as well, and I'll share this out. And we have 50 that do and 50 that don't. So that's helpful to know as well. And the next poll question we have is, can you identify a community population that resides in your area that doesn't utilize your services? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close that. And I will share the results. And it seems like 63% says that they can identify and 38% says that they cannot. Okay, and the very last poll question is, have you worked with, referred to, collaborated with culturally specific, identity specific, differently abled specific, age specific, etc. Populations? Yes or no? Okay, everybody answered that fairly quickly, so I'm going to go ahead and close that out. And I will share the results, which is 100% of people who are in the webinar today have identified that they do work with underserved populations in one way or another. So those are the answers to the questions that we have. I'll go ahead and close that out. And again, my name is Ty. I'm helping facilitate this webinar with Marae. And I will also be facilitating the questions portion of this webinar as well. So if you have questions, there is a questions tab. If you want to go ahead and click on that, type in your question, and we will answer questions as we go throughout this webinar today. So please feel free to type in your questions whenever you have them, and I will check on that and we'll try to answer them as we go. We'll also try to leave about 5-10 minutes at the end of the webinar so that we can answer more specific questions at the end. But I'll allow Marae now to talk a little bit about the goals and objectives of the webinar for today.
Perfect. Thank you, Ty. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Marae. I'm the Underserved Populations Community Advocate, and my position is fairly new to me, but I've been working in the field for a while now. And my objective for this webinar today is exploring some ways that we as individuals and also working within our programs can better support underserved and underrepresented communities. And we'll have a little conversation on what underserved and underrepresented communities look like, the different dimensions and aspects, backgrounds, what have you, of the communities that we work with. Goals are to identify better practices for creating safe spaces, and we will also touch base on the types of spaces that we're creating in terms of safety. So we'll talk about the individual, the space that they're working within, and their interaction with clients. And Ty will briefly go over some details of interpreter services, safety planning, and best practices. And we will also be identifying communication strategies that will help build trust and rapport with our individuals that we're working with. And we'll cover a wide range of communication and what that might look like for us in the field. We'll also discuss factors that are involved in a sustainable, culturally considerate program. And my position is essentially communicating with communities and listening to them and exploring all of the needs that differ or are similar from each other, and providing a comprehensive working relationship with every single community that we serve, which is statewide. We are a statewide organization, and we're really trying to expand and adapt and collaborate with the changing needs of each community who have historically been underserved. So a lot of the individuals in the communities that you work with will fall under that category. So my position, my goal, are to first increase awareness. So if you're in this webinar, you already know who we are, and awesome. Thank you for doing that and being here. But there is a lot of room for awareness that we could work on as an organization and also as a community of advocates working in DVSA. Another goal is establishing working relationships with communities. So reciprocity is a really big goal of mine personally and professionally. And making that working relationship, that constant communication, so that we are adapting as quickly as we need to be. And incorporating needs and models from communities, and incorporating those communication models, traditions, communication styles into our training, services, advocacy, and just the way that we talk and work with each other, really. And so I'm going to let Ty take over a little bit and talk about anti-oppression frameworks and what does it look like to support underserved populations.
All right, thank you, Marie. Before me and Marie even started working on the PowerPoint and kind of figuring out what we wanted to talk about, one of the big things that we sat down and met on was, you know, this webinar and what are the main messages we wanted to get to participants. Like, this is the first webinar that me and Maria have done together. This is the first one where we're talking about providing advocacy to underserved populations and how does that look like and what do advocates need to know. And we brought up one foundational thing. We both kind of thought that it was really important that we address this. And so I said, yeah, I would like to start off and talk about that. And that is to talk about what we as professionals who work in domestic violence and sexual violence programs, what should we be doing before we can even address providing the direct services to underserved populations. And what I mean by that is, do we really have to be concerned with providing direct services to underserved populations if people from those communities aren't coming out and seeking our services? Like people who won't come and seek our services when they don't feel like it's safe to do so. And when they feel that our program and our staff can help them in a way where they can feel respected, heard, and validated, like that is when people from marginalized communities will start to call us and communicate with us and seek our services. And so to do this, I wanted to talk about the need to be practicing an anti-oppression framework. And so practicing an anti-oppression framework is to consider people's experiences and not judge people for their situations. It's a way of naming oppression that happens to certain groups of people based on their identities, and then a way to work toward ending that mistreatment, oppression, and violence toward that particular group. So practicing that anti-oppression work also involves confronting ourselves and oppression in our communities. Um, Utilizing alternative models of interactions. I remember when I was providing direct advocacy and I wanted to reach out to the Hispanic community in our area. And the reason that I really wanted to do that was because our program, we were getting reports from law enforcement about domestic assaults and other types of cases that was happening in the community, but we weren't getting a very good response when we were calling the individuals who was experiencing that. And they weren't coming into our offices. They weren't reaching out when we were saying, we want to help you safety plan. We want to help you file for orders of protections. Like we are here and we want to help you. We were seeing and noticing that people weren't reaching out to us, even though we were reaching out to them in the ways that we felt like was beneficial. And so we had to recognize that it was unrealistic of me to wait in my office for people from that community to come to me, and that I needed to go to them. And one of the things that I had done was I reached out to people from their own community, from the Hispanic community, people that did a lot of work with that community, and asked them to introduce me to the community members. I tabled at their events, churches, at you know kindergarten events and school events and things like that. Went to community functions, and I started to build relationships. And that's when our program began noticing that people then, after they knew me, knew my name, knew that I was invested in doing this work and that I really wanted to be a support system. That's when I started to build that trust and people started coming to seek services. Um, Recognize power imbalances and work to change those imbalances. So while building the relationships, I listened to the needs of the community. I listened when they shared stories and how they would like to see change. And I offered to be an ally and to help in areas that I felt I could be of influence. And so it's not only about, you know, showing up and tabling at the events or saying that I want to provide services. It's actually being an ally and, and doing that footwork of what I was saying I wanted to do. And the last part, understand hierarchy. And for me, I never knew about hierarchy until I took a course in college. And so this term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And basically, hierarchy is the concept that all systems of oppression are interconnected and they form a larger overall system of domination, which is called hierarchy. And this means that individually, in some aspects of our lives, we may experience marginalization and lack of power, while in other aspects of our lives, we have privilege and power. So, while a person may be a part of an unidentifiable group who is historically marginalized, they may also have a role and be a member of a group that has power in society. So, I like to use myself for an example. For example, myself, I'm a woman who is a refugee from Laos, while at the same time, I feel like I do have some privilege because I have an education. I was able to go to school. I was able to go and get my bachelor's degree. I'm currently now in school to get my master's degree. I mean, some of those things allow me to also have built relationships with people who have power. And also because I do have an education, because I know language, because I, you know, of where I live and where I work and things like that, that has given me some privilege. So just by using myself as an example, and looking at hierarchy has really helped me to understand how oppression can affect people differently, even though they're from the same um, identity or they identify the same way. Okay, so after talking about, you know, what does it look like to support underserved populations, I wanted to also talk about what does it mean to be an ally. Underserved communities need allies, right? And most of us want to be an ally, but we're confused to how to do that. And for me, some of the best allies that I have had in my lifetime have modeled some of the following behaviors that I'm going to talk about now that are in this slide. And that is they actively acknowledge their power and their privilege and they openly discuss them. So they're supportive and they make use of their privilege and power. They often engage in conversations with people who share their same identity and privilege with the hopes to motivate change. Um, they listen more and they speak less. So the allies I've had, they hold back on their ideas, their opinions, and don't always come to my meetings or come to me with solutions to save the community that I'm from. They recognize that they can help with being a resource, they can help with providing support, and that we from that community, we will figure out the solutions that fit the needs that we have and that we identify. Um, Having integrity. And so that is like taking guidance and direction from myself and they keep their word when they offered it to help me, take on a project. They're there, they're consistent, and they follow through with what they promise me that they will do. And also, not expecting to be educated by others. So continuously doing their own research, you know.
Yeah, and I would add, this is especially important when you're working directly with your clients because a lot of us, and I've made this mistake too, of using that opportunity and that interaction to receive information about their culture that may or may not be pertinent or important information for that situation. Like knowing what to ask that is relevant to the situation versus what you are simply wanting to know for your own curiosity may or may not be harmful for the client that you're serving at the moment. And a lot of the times they don't have the capacity to answer those specific cultural questions. So knowing when and where to get that kind of information outside of working with your clients and asking them directly is really important for trauma informed care.
Right. And nobody wants to be like, for me, I am not the expert in my community. There's lots of people in my community that know a lot more than I do. And also, there's people who've written books about it, you know. So I don't like to pretend that I'm the expert or that I know everything, but I am more than willing and I'm happy to share my own personal experience in some of those things, but don't expect that I am always willing to do that whenever you have a question, you know. So I think that's an important thing to remember. Um, Receiving of criticism. So allies have to be honest and accountable with their mistakes and recognize that being called out for making a mistake is actually an honor. So it signifies that we trust you, number one, and that you're given the chance to be a better person, to learn, to grow, to do things differently. When people stop calling you out, when people stop communicating with you, that means there's no trust. That means that if you have presented yourself as an ally to me and all of a sudden I stop returning your phone calls, I see you at the grocery store and I just take off and go the other way, I no longer see you as an ally and something happened. And if I don't feel that I have the capacity to share with you what happened, like, you know, that's a big problem. And so if somebody does do that, if somebody does call you out, instead of taking that as a criticism, look at that as the ability that they trust you, number one. And also, it's an ability for you to grow and become a better person.
hmm And
Um,
we'll talk about that a little bit
mhm,
later on and why that's important. And it's important to also note that criticism is primarily famously known as a negative word, right? When we think
mhm,
of
mhm,
criticism, we think of judgment, we think of negative connotations. We might think that someone's coming at our entirety as a person, that so just because we said something problematic means that we as individuals are problematic. And it's really important to note that that is absolutely not the intention. And what Ty is saying is really important because if that person has the courage and the trust and the ability to invest their time in correcting a behavior that is ultimately going to serve you purpose, that's going to serve that person purpose, and that's also just contributing to the healing process as a community that we're doing. So
mhm.
criticism should not be seen as a negative thing. I know call out culture has a very negative connotation to it,
Right,
but it's important to note how productive that constructive criticism could be.
right, right. Thanks for that, Marie.
Mhm.
And also embracing the emotions that come out of the process of allyship. So when you decide to become an ally, understand that things are going to be uncomfortable and you're going to feel challenged. And that's really important. You have to go into allyship knowing that it's difficult and that you won't always come back home feeling good about yourself. Um, and I want to note that you wouldn't be a good ally if you weren't feeling uncomfortable. Like there's being an ally, just take it that it's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to be called out on some things. And if you're not called out on it, you yourself will be asking yourself, like, wow, that has happened before. I have partake in that behavior, or I have seen that happen. And even if I didn't partake in that behavior, I didn't do anything about it, you know? And so just know that that's part of allyship and that that's part of growing and that's part of being a good person and knowing that we're not perfect human beings, but we do have the capacity to be able to influence and change and overall work on changing the social structures and how things are dealt with in our own communities. Okay. Continuing on about allyship, um, I want to talk a little bit about things that you can constantly be asking yourself while you're doing this, just to make sure that you're doing your due diligence while you're doing practicing allyship. So we have opportunities to participate allyship every day in our work life and in our personal life, and some questions to consider the next time when you're in a meeting or you're working on a project. How much am I talking? Am I allowing others around the table to share their knowledge and experience? How can I get more people to the meeting or event that represent or look like the community I live in? What creative ways can I advertise or promote for involvement? What is my body language like at the meetings? Is it welcoming? A lot of times, people who are used to not being invited to the table don't know how to act or what to do when they are asked to participate. I recall back in the day a time when I was part of a board for a program in the local school district, and the director of the program wanted to have board members that represented the families in the school. And so, as a board member, I assisted in the recruitment process, and we were successful in getting people from different cultures on the board. But noticed that after the first meeting, they stopped showing up, and the ones that still showed up didn't talk much, didn't share. And so, what I want to say is, the fact is, people from other cultures just aren't accustomed to how boards are in the U.S. function. And when you're on a board, there's this thing called Robert's Rule of Order, and not all people know about that. Even people who were born in the United States don't know about that. I, like I said before, I was a refugee. I came to the United States when I was, I think I was like 7 or 8 or so. And so I did go to school most of my years in the United States, and I went to college, and I didn't even know about that. That's not taught to me. It wasn't until I joined my first board, and I was seeing how boards were functioning, and I was seeing, you know, how it was being run, and I stopped and I asked somebody. Then somebody went over and reviewed that with me. I was like, oh, I see. And so it took me to do that. And not everybody is as comfortable in asking questions as I am. So, review your onboarding system with new members. Go over details about how meetings are run. What are the roles of people on a board, committee, on a group? Like, what are the expectations and other details you feel like would be beneficial whenever you have new people joining a board or a committee? Like, go over some of those details with them. Let them know, the meeting usually starts at 5, but we start showing up at 4:45 to do, to get coffee, to whatever. So sharing and all of those little details will help ease people as they join new committees and new groups. Um, Having a one-on-one meeting with new members and ask if there's any questions prior to the first meeting is also really important. So carving out that additional time, that additional half hour, and saying, this is going to be your first meeting. I want to meet with you in person before that, and let's go over some of this stuff. And then also after the first meeting, following up with them. Ask if there's anything that they were confused about during the meeting. Ask if there's anything that you can do to help answer any of their questions. And if there's anything that they would like, more explanation of about or whatever. And so by doing those things can really help in there's so much work in recruiting people, right? To be a part of a board, to be part of a committee that you just don't want people to be falling off. And communicating and doing that sincere personal interactions with people can go a really long way. There is a video, right? We have a video here that I'm not going to share right now. It's about good allyship. I'm hoping that we can share it at the end if we have time, but I didn't want to take up too much time of the presentation because I know Marie has a lot to talk about. And so we'll just come back to that, Marie, if there's time in the end, okay?
Okay, sounds good. Yep, and Ty touched on a lot of really, really important concepts that I will have the pleasure of getting into a little bit more detail today. But we were joking because I feel like this is a topic that we could talk for days, weeks, years on nonstop. So there may or may
Yeah,
not be a
totally.
part two or a part three, or
Uh-huh. Yeah,
it
we
just
were doing a walkthrough of this, me and Marie, and we just like got really deep into it, and we're like, oh my God, this could be like the Ty and Marie talk show. Like we could just
and
go
it
on and on about this, but we gotta rein it in. So
and it might be. So let's hear any comments. If we should make a
yes,
show of this, let
please.
us know.
Yeah, let us know if you would like a Ty and Marie show or Marie and Ty show,
Yeah.
whatever.
Equal opportunity. So some things to consider. So why are we even talking about this? This is important for a lot of reasons. And the most important reason, I think, is to recognize the reason why we all get into this kind of work, right? People always ask me that, like, "Oh, you're work for domestic violence, sexual assault. That's really intense. Why? Why? Just why?" And sometimes I'm prepared to answer, sometimes I'm not prepared to answer. And I feel like the answer is constantly changing. Maybe that's just me, but why is this important work for you individually? Does it have something to do with your experience? Does it have something to do with your identity or your background? Does it have something to do with your ability, your skills? You find that this is your niche. Um, why do we find that this work is something that we need in our lives? And a lot of the reason behind that is that we are empathetic creatures. We're very helping. We need that position and that job to work with other people and make us feel like we're actually doing something and creating a difference, right? We all know that. I know that. I'm giving you all of the credit in the work that you do. But some of the things that get overlooked when we receive trainings, when we talk to each other, when we talk to people outside of our field, are the uncomfortable topics, such as what are our biases? What are our fears? What are our weaknesses? What are the things that we fear affect our ability to do our jobs? And we all know that a lot of people that are outside of the field see us as heroes. We are superheroes. My family calls me Wonder Woman. They put a cape on me. They are super proud, which I love. But at the same time, um, it's hard to recognize that we are human beings and we have tendencies. We all have patterns and habits, and that some of our experiences and our ideologies and our values are not only inconsistent with others, specifically our clients, the people that we work with, and some of them are just maladaptive. Some of them we might need to change. And if we're not looking into every aspect of ourselves in every single capacity, which seems really complicated, it's eventually going to affect us and our abilities to do our jobs. So this is an important webinar that could go on forever, and it will constantly change, but it's important to at least get thinking about some of these topics. And I found that this was really important to do. So some opening questions are, how do you learn about others? So how are you receiving your information? Like Ty mentioned, how are you learning about other cultures, about other identities, about other backgrounds that are separate from yours? How do you keep track of your self-awareness? And I will talk about self-awareness and self-assessment. We're going to get a little bit real today, people. I'm not going to lie. It's going to get real. So just know that we're all in this together, and it's okay to feel uncomfortable, like Ty said, because chances are you might. And I want to apologize, but it's good for us. So I'm not going to. Where is your information coming from? So where are you receiving information from about other people? So obviously social media, news, Instagram, messaging, virtual communication is really big right now. And the good part is there's a lot of access to information. The bad part is a lot of that is maladaptive, stereotypical, and damaging. So, how do you sift the productive and the accurate information about other people from the systemic, damaging, and hurtful information that is put out there? And who do you surround yourself with? Who are your friends? Who are the people that you love and that love you? Who are your support systems when you're having a bad day? Who are your establishments, your community centers, your safe spaces outside of your work? Are there people that are different from you in those spaces? Are there friends, family, nieces, nephews? Who do you surround yourself with? Political leaders, who are leaders in your community that you look up to and respect, do they come from a different background than you? And one important concept that Ty and I could not let go is being culturally competent. That the word competency is awful. It is a very old school, ancient word that I do not understand, but it has been used time and time again. To be culturally competent is not only damaging, but it's also impossible for a lot of different reasons. First of all, my first issue with it is to be incompetent is the opposite. And that means if we're not competent, we're incompetent, which means we're, we're, we're lacking information completely. We are navigating in the dark. We don't have any basis. We're dumb, I guess, for lack of a better word. I'm not sure. Unintelligent. It's not a good thing to feel. So, first of all, it's already setting you up for maladaptive behaviors. And obviously, we don't want to think of ourselves as incompetent. So, that's damaging on your self image. You're not giving yourself any credit, and there's no way to assess where you are at with your knowledge base, with your skills, and how do you go about finding that information if you already have that sense of, well, if I'm not competent, if I 100% don't know about the community that I'm working with, I'm not able to do my job. So why am I here in the first place? And I'm sure Ty has a good example of that. She's mentioned about trainings and how they label them as culturally competent trainings. I've personally never
Yeah.
been to one of those, but
Well, back in the day, Marie, so I've been doing this work for over 2 decades, so I'll share the old day stories with y'all. Back in the day, we would be required to go to trainings that were labeled cultural competency training. And I remember I was super frustrated one time because a coworker of mine from the school went to a culturally competent training. It was a half day, conference. And the person came back from the cultural competency training and felt like they were a professional, like they knew everything about this community and this culture because they had attended this half day cultural competency training. And it just kind of insulting to me because it's like, I'm from that community. I don't even know if I'm an expert. And here you went to a half day training and now you're competent and you feel like you don't need to go to training ever again and that you're done. And so I was a little bit insulted by that, and that's one of the stories I was sharing with Marie. Like I want to get away with that word of the cultural competency because I don't think you're ever able to be competent about anybody else's culture and things like that because like I said, I can identify from the Lao community, and yet I can't even say that I am 100% competent about that community. There's always things that I can learn more and know more about. And the fact that I wasn't raised in Laos, like I was born in Laos. I came to the United States, but I was not even 10 yet. And then I was raised in America by parents who taught me the Lao ways. But there's a lot of lived experience that I missed out on. And so that's why I say I can't be 100% competent in that community and don't expect that from attending a 2 day conference or a half a day seminar that you're going to be culturally competent as well. Like we need to do away with that term.
yeah. And from personal perspective, that just makes me feel uncomfortable. Like you said, Ty, I am definitely not what is 100% competent in my identity and
Oh
my
no, there's
culture
no
even mean.
scale. There's no rating. Like, do you know about this? Do
Yeah,
you know
like
the terminology of, yeah, I mean,
what
there
does
is
it
no rating.
mean? Yeah.
No rating and no scale. But
Yeah. And we will back you up on that. To be culturally competent, like I don't it's a question mark. I don't even know who came up with that.
I don't think people
So
use it anymore as much. I still hear it here and there, but
yeah.
that's one of the reasons when I didn't even think about it. Marie did. She put it up in her slide. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you have this in here.
Hmm.
It's been bothering me. I just like never thought to share it, and so I'm doing it now.
Yep. Let's do it. Let's do ourselves a favor and make a pledge today, right now, that we're never going to use that word ever again. It's okay if you already have. We're not going to judge you.
I mean,
Just
I might have been okay with it until I thought about it a lot. I mean, there's lots of things that we are okay with until we really sit down and think about, like honest
Mhm.
to truth, like that is life.
Mhm. Mhm. Yep, no one's completely exempt from that. And
Hmm.
that plays into this piece of privilege. So, to have privilege, what does that mean, right? So this is a really good visual of one type of privilege. I'm not saying it's the type of privilege, but this is kind of what we think about when we think of privilege, right? So there's the straight white male, cisgender, probably he's got a suit on, pretty good job. I don't know if he's not wearing socks. I'm not sure why he wouldn't be, but that's okay. That's not an important detail. But so when you're looking at privilege, you're looking at a specific type. But the point of this visual that I find very effective, and of course there's multiple types of points, are um, there are some of us that live and navigate this world in a system that is set up against us, right? And if we don't acknowledge that and we don't talk about it and we don't listen to each other, we're going to continue on this path that is perceived to be the same distance, perceived to be the same amount of difficulty, but we all know that it's definitely not the case. So comparatively, how are we talking and listening and reciprocating interactions with each other to unpack that really tightly knit, really old type of systemic privilege that is established? And I received this image from a training at Minva, and it was really effective to me because it just shows that um, even though some of us have more or less privilege as an identity, as we appear to other people, there is a pyramid. So I'm learning a lot about the privilege pyramid. So when you think of a triangle, you think of like the food categories. There's different levels on this triangle. And where you are as a, for example, like Ty and I, women of color, we tend to be on the lower part of this pyramid. So there's more of us that have less privilege. We're all congregating at the bottom. And there are obviously way less people at the top that experience more privilege on a systemic level. But the thing about having multiple identities and multiple things that make you up as an individual is that, like Ty explained, some parts of us, we are at the top of that triangle. So, like Ty, she mentioned having an education, but she's also a refugee. So looking at those two concepts, one's at the top of the pyramid and the other's at the bottom. And I can explain for myself, being mixed race, Latino, indigenous descent, I am documented. I was born in the US, so that is my top of the pyramid privilege, but I'm still a queer woman of color. So that is going to knock me at the bottom where a lot of other people are. So there's a concept of being multiply marginalized. So different parts of our identity, for the most part, if they're at the bottom, we are going to experience a lot more systemic prejudice, a lot more um, invalidation, a lot more uh, things that we need to jump through, like this awful, awful thing that this poor woman has to go through with a chain on her ankle. And there's a crocodile in there with bricks. Like, we have to navigate the same system with these multiple identities that are at the bottom of this privilege pyramid. So it's important to think about where you are and where you come from and what your experiences are and where you might be at the bottom of this pyramid in order to empathize with people. That is where you should take advantage of your empathy and your experiences when you're at the bottom of this privilege pyramid in certain experiences, so that you can maintain relationships, establish, and use that to learn about other people. And that's where self-awareness and assessment comes into play. So we as human beings have multiple concepts that construct us as a whole person, right? So I'm going to be taking a lot of things that I'm learning in therapy. So I'm in school right now for trauma therapy. So we are approaching this today. I'm taking a lot of training and concepts from trauma therapy and how to be a good therapist, which is important for us as advocates to know the basics of that because we are working with a human being. And a lot of the times we're one of their first contacts. A lot of them don't have a therapist, a lot of them don't have mental health counseling, a lot of them have really limited access to these kinds of resources. So I want you to be aware of these concepts that we are learning as therapists to apply and consider with yourselves when you're working with these individuals. So to be self-aware and to be able to assess yourself, you're going to be looking at these concepts. So you're going to be looking at your personality, and I'm going to get into these, don't worry. There's communication styles, how we communicate with people, and that's going to be verbal, nonverbal, explicit, implicit. I'll explain what that is, I promise. And body language. So how are we communicating with individuals nonverbally with our bodies? And what are our social, environmental, and societal influences on bias? Bias is a sneaky, sneaky creature. It is something that is going to take a long time to work through, and it's constantly changing. So it's important to realize that I'm going to touch on these subjects, and you're not going to fix these tomorrow. You're not going to fix these 5, 10 years from now. It's going to be an ongoing process, but as long as you have a basis, a 101, an introduction into these concepts, and you may have already thought of these things in the past, but you're kind of like, oh, yeah, that's a thing, but what do I do with it? So you just forget it because we don't have time to think about this stuff, let's be honest. But I'm giving you an opportunity today to think about it. So if you can, take notes. I challenge you to take notes about yourself, not even the information that I'm telling you. Make this pertinent to you and your individual growth. So let me see here. Like I said, self-awareness is really important for a lot of reasons. One of them is balance. So we as advocates, we hold a lot of responsibility, a lot of responsibility, sometimes way too much responsibility. We have a list of goals, right, that we need to accomplish even before the client walks in the door. A lot of us have intakes we have to do. A lot of us have checklists, goals. We have all of this paperwork that needs to be signed. Depending on what you do and where you are and how you obtain this information, a lot of us have an entire packet, hours worth of documentation before this person even walks in the door. That is daunting to me. That was terrifying to me when I first started this position. Working in social work, not this specific position, but when my first job in working with domestic violence and sexual assault is the paperwork is incredible. So we have that expectation. You have to find a very delicate balance between your crisis intervention, your counsel, your education, and your safety planning. So we're juggling all of these tasks as advocates, and this is extremely difficult for us, especially when you're meeting an individual for the first time. You have no idea who they are, you don't know anything about them. Chances are you kind of do. Let's say you know a couple of things about this person, but for the most part, you don't know them as an individual yet. And this is a scary moment. And it's important because you need to know who you are as a person so that you can learn about another individual. And it's even more important when you're meeting someone for the first time. You don't know anything about them. And if you don't know anything about yourself, the chances of making a meaningful connection is going to be very low. So having that self-awareness before that person walks in the door is extremely important. So once you're truly aware of yourself, you have the ability to add things, take things away, and kind of, I think of it as molding myself into a form that's going to be helpful. I want to mold myself and my being, use my skills to adjust and be a helpful energy that is needed by whoever walks in the door. You have to adjust yourself sometimes. And we'll talk about personality when I get to that. But if you deny yourself a self-reflection process, there are consequences to that for you, for yourself, for the field, for your individuals that are seeking services. It's just not good for anyone if we're not being self-aware. And another important concept of this balance is we tend, like I said, with the culturally competent, right? So there's competency and there's incompetency. There's good and bad, right? So we get stuck in these two categories. It's a very linear process that we put ourselves in. So when we think of self-assessment like competent and incompetent, we're thinking of qualities that are good and evil, loving or hateful, that we're capable or incapable, effective versus ineffective. These are two categories that we are just so incredibly solidified in. We're stuck in these two categories. So when we're thinking of ourselves as individuals, when we're self-reflecting, we're thinking of bad and good qualities, and these are damaging. This is a damaging pattern, and unfortunately, we're all taught this because it's easier, right? It's easier to categorize in good and bad. So you don't have to think about it. It's efficient, it gets the job done, but it's not productive in the long run. And we bury these. So once we categorize the good and bad characteristics of ourselves, it's in our profession, we have a tendency to just bury it. We're like, okay, that's bad. I don't want to be that kind of person. I don't want to have these qualities. So I'm just going to ignore them. I'm going to throw them away. They're inefficient. That is not good. We need to be transitioning from that linear thinking, and we need to go back to a lot of our traditional concepts. Like there's ancient medicines and concepts that think of things as balanced, as a circular pattern. And a good example is in indigenous communities, we think of the medicine wheel. So we're thinking in circles. Everything has to be balanced. It's not good or bad. It's never good or bad. It's different. It is everything needs to work together to create a balance. And that's how we need to be thinking when we're self-aware. Another good example is yin and yang, sorry, my pronunciation. So thinking in circles and thinking of that balance and having qualities in each of these categories that work together to create a whole person. You should never feel ashamed of a quality that you have because of what you've experienced or where you come from or what your identity is. Another good one is the mandala and the Tonalpo Wali, which is our sacred calendar in Mexica culture. Everything is a circle, and this is really common with indigenous communities that have been around for a long time. We think of this balance as medicine. It's something that keeps us together with ourselves and with our communities. And I really feel like this is something that we need to implement as advocates, because we all are beautifully starting to interact with each other. We have a variety of different cultures, and we have different people, and we have multiple identities that need to be respected and embraced and incorporated into the work that we do. We cannot keep thinking of this binary with anything. I just want to get rid of it completely. I want to go back to circles because it's more healing, it's more balanced for me. So having that self-awareness is really good. And some of the things that Ty mentioned is healthy assessment is an ongoing process, like we said. You need to be able to look back at yourself and notice the changes that you have. And you're not the same person that you were 5 years ago. You weren't the same person. I wasn't the same person like 2 months ago. It changes. So you have to have this repetitive process of self-assessment. And it's healthy because you hold yourself accountable. We cannot expect to remain the same. So we need to be holding ourselves accountable for how we've changed, how we've chosen to change ourselves for the better with ourselves and other people. You need to change in your individual self, with your family, with your community, with your environment that you live and navigate. And they're all constantly changing. Our environments are not meant to stay the same. And to think that way is unproductive. It might be safer, it might be more comfortable, but unfortunately, that's not the case. So we need to be on our toes and holding ourselves accountable. And we are able, when we self-assess, we're able to recognize patterns and trends, growth, maladaptive behaviors, obviously. If you're looking back at yourself and you're like, okay, that was not cool. I learned from that though. And no, like I said, no one is independent of this. It doesn't matter what kind of privilege you have. It doesn't matter what kind of identity you have. We have all in the past done and said things that are problematic, even for our own communities, that we need to learn from. And you're able to be honest with yourself, genuine, flexible, and open-minded. That is the type of quality that we need in advocacy. Because if you're comfortable, if you're honest and genuine and open-minded with your own experiences, you're going to be that same exact way with whoever's walking in your door. And that is beautiful. That is mandatory in this work. And you need to know your limitations. You need to know when things hit too close to home. Ty mentioned you need to know when you are unable to work with a certain person. If there's someone else in your office or in the community or at another organization that's better and more equipped to work with that person, where are your resources? Where are your connections in your relationships to reach out and ask for help? And most importantly, you know your strengths, you know your boundaries, you know where and when and how you're able to get a balance in your life. And let me see here. Do you have anything to add?
Oh, I think you're doing
Nope.
great.
Okay, sweet. So personality, it's a really broad concept, right? So it's obviously really important to know what kind of personality you are when you're working with your clients and the people who are coming in. Some of us, everyone's different. Everyone's different. I'm noting 4 key areas. The beautiful thing about personality is that we're all over the place, and you'll know when I start talking about personality that you might be today a certain way, but tomorrow it's going to be completely different, and that's okay because you're human and that happens. So the main aspects of personality is your mind. So how you interact with your surroundings, how we're giving and receiving energy. So introverted people, which such as myself, I'm definitely an introvert. So we get exhausted by social interactions. Doesn't mean we're bad at interacting. We are very social creatures sometimes, but the fact of the matter is we get drained. We are sensitive to more external stimulation. Again, it doesn't mean that you're incapable. You can handle crisis and you can do your job very well. However, you are sensitive to that, and it might need a specific safety plan for self-care after, and you need to recharge in smaller social settings or alone in your own space. I need to go home and be by myself by the end of the day, and everyone knows that, and that's okay.
And I think knowing your own personality, why it's really important, and me and Marie talked a little bit about this prior to the webinar as well, is when you know your own personality, you know also your the best way that you can provide advocacy to the people that you're serving, right? And when you're aware of yourself, when you're aware of your own personality, when you come into and like what Marie said, today you might be showing this type of personality, tomorrow you might be showing another type of personality. So what I say to do, what I try to do, I don't do it every day, but is checking in with yourself every morning and so that you know where you're at that day. Because ultimately, what we want to do is we want to be the best advocate for the people that we are providing services for, right? And if we know that today um, we're sending off a different type of energy than what we would like to be sending out, then being aware of that so that we can check ourselves, so that we can maybe correct that before we do any harm, I think is
Mm-hmm.
really important. Because we all have, we all have our good days and we all have our bad days. And like Marie said that she's an introvert, I kind of see myself as an extrovert. I'm I'm kind of extroverted, but there are some days though that I don't want to be. And so the healthy thing to do with that then is to check with yourself every day so that you make sure that you're being fair to the people that you're providing services for, because that's your responsibility to do. It's not the other person's responsibility to do. When people are coming and seeking services from us, we need to be able to provide them with um, good advocacy, and regardless of what it is that we are experiencing, we need to be able to tuck that away in the time that we're working with that person. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It does.
Knowing that we're
Yep.
human beings, yeah, knowing that we're human beings and that we are not alone in doing this work, and that we do have coworkers that can provide us support too.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
mhm.
And if this is a really cool link I posted right here. It's called 16 Personalities, and it's free. It's really interesting. It's kind of like the Myers-Briggs if you're familiar with that, and it just gives you like a basic, someplace to start to get to know yourself and start with that self-assessment process. So I posted that. Check it out. Let me know. We can talk about it. That was supposed to be a moving gift of Wally, which if you haven't seen that movie, it's incredible. It's like a 2-hour movie, and all of mostly it's just nonverbal communication. And it's incredible to me that that movie exists, and it says a lot about communication styles. So how we're using our communication and our tendencies and our habits in our communication to get a point across, verbal, nonverbal, with our social interactions with people. And we talked about, obviously verbal is, how you speak. This is how the words that you choose to use and the conversation style that you choose to use with other people. So nonverbal is not only sneakier, and we're a lot of the times unconscious of these, but they're equally as important. So nonverbal is your voice. So if you have a loud, booming, assertive voice, like I feel like I have, and I'm sorry if I'm too loud sometimes, but you got to pay attention to your pitch. If you're speaking too fast, what your volume is, that could really affect someone who is more soft spoken, with who speaks slower and who speaks um, more quietly, with more of an observer, right? So there's less words being spoken. If they're matched up with me, who's loud, booming, talks really fast, gets really excited way too easily, I need to adjust the way that I speak. I need to slow my voice down. I have to put on my therapy voice. I definitely have a therapy voice. And I need to adjust myself to make them feel more comfortable. And that it takes practice, but I promise that if you become more self-aware and you practice that, you will definitely get better at it. And I certainly have. What does your posture look like? Are you cross-legged? Are you fidgeting? Are you playing with your hair? Are you playing with something on your shirt? Or do you look nervous? Because that's what it's going to come off as. Are you moving around a lot? Or are you more relaxed? Are you um, sitting in your chair a certain way? Where are you in terms of spatial position? Position. Ooh, geez. Are you someone who likes to sit closer to somebody so that you can hear them, so you feel closer to them? Or do you feel like your personal boundary is further away? That could be misinterpreted as being cold or not wanting to interact with somebody. So is your position respectful of people's boundaries? And are you taking their body language and registering it and making adjustments accordingly? What are your adjusters like? Are you abrupt? Are you fidgety, like I said? Unfortunately, it's kind of hard to not be if it's 2 o'clock and you've had 3 cups of coffee. But it's really important to be aware of that. If you notice it, changing it right away and trying to be more relaxed and trying to slow your voice down and make it softer for the person, right? And handshaking, we mentioned handshaking. So this is a perfect example of imposing culture onto someone else. And it's something really insignificant. It seems something insignificant, but it's actually really important, and for a lot of reasons. First of all, a lot of cultures don't handshake. People come to this country and that is a completely new thing. And I see it as you're imposing a tradition that they may or may not be familiar with. And that is something that never should happen. You should really accommodate that person and make them feel more comfortable. And obviously, we're dealing with people we're not dealing, sorry, the poor choice of words. We are providing services and interacting with people who have experienced violence, physical violence, things that involve touching. So touching a stranger, even if it's as simple as a handshake, can be very uncomfortable for somebody. So that's being respectful of your spatial positioning and your respect for where they come from culturally, demographically, and also just spatially. You're respecting their whole self. Same thing with hugging or touching in general. We need to be very self-aware about what that person is capable and comfortable receiving in terms of touching, right? We have a lot of people experiencing trauma or have really bad interactions with physical touch and affection. So be mindful of handshakes when you're introducing yourself to someone for the first time. I personally make it a point not to do handshaking. I'm bad at it. I think it's awkward. I just don't do it
Yeah, and I
unless I have to.
remember, yeah, I remember like back in my when I did direct advocacy, like how you give comfort to someone that is, in your office with you and talking. I have to constantly be checking myself, like, is the person, do they want me to give them a hug? Some in the American culture, if you want to comfort somebody, it's like, can I give you a hug? So asking for that permission and not to assume that that is something that everybody is going to be comfortable with. And also sometimes when when you're listening to someone and they're sharing with you, the experience that they've gone through that could be traumatic for them and things like that. Like, you know, how are they sharing that with you? And does it feel like what can you be doing to provide support for that person if the way that you provide support is by hugging somebody or by touching their shoulder and you don't feel like it's comfortable to be able to do that, like, what should you be doing? And these are the kinds of things that you can think about prior to the situation. And so, I mean, for me, when I don't think that the other person would really want me to hug them. I mean, I'm not a hugger, so I don't want to hug people anyways, but I know that people want to have asked me to hug me sometimes, and I'll say no, I don't want to. And the even the ability for me to be able to say no, like, takes a lot of courage for me to be able to say no, because a lot of times people don't want to say no. So just being mindful of even asking too, like, can I give you a hug? Like, sometimes the other person might not feel comfortable in telling you no. So modeling what you see them doing, how interactive are they? Like, how touchy feely is the person and things like that. Like, and even taking culture out of the equation, I feel like as individuals, we all have our own comfort levels in that.
Hmm. Absolutely. And a part of that, like you said, is how you react, how your initial reaction and what your action is. So these are some really good examples of things to consider. How do you react to these things, and how you choose to act on them? So conflict, obviously, really uncomfortable. What is your initial reaction when there's conflict, and how do you problem solve with that. Critique and constructive criticism, like we said, calling out culture. So when someone approaches you and says, "This, I don't like the way that you say this," or I feel like this is problematic behavior and I want to talk to you about it. Crisis, obviously, how do we handle crisis? Are we problem solvers? Are we, okay, what do we do right now? Are we people that need to talk it through? Are we people that get overwhelmed and we need to step back before we can make actual decisions? None of these things are bad or good. I'm just saying they're different. So it's good to be aware of these things. Um, what are your reactions and reactions when you receive expressed emotions from your individuals that are seeking services? So expressed emotions are frantic, unorganized. The person's they're not making much sense with their story, or they're confrontational. They're getting really angry, or they're really in a lot of distress. So their volume is increased and their agitation is increased, and it's obvious that they're getting really worked up about whatever situation that they're in. How do you choose to react to that kind of personality, to that energy, to that situation? On the other end, how do you react to controlled emotions from clients? Is there a lot of silence? Are they not responding at all to your questions or your interaction? And they're giving you one-word responses. They're stonewalling you completely. They are very obviously not wanting to be in that room. How do you react to that? Are you taking it personally, or are you understanding the context of the situation and you're giving them options? Learning and affirming. That's really nerdy, but how are you learning about things, and how are you affirming that you're learning? I feel like I'm rapping now. How are you giving affirmation to other people? And do you have patience and trust building? A lot of us know that we may or may not see that person once or multiple times. We might not ever see them again. We might see them once a day, 3 times a day, once a week, whatever. How do we have patience in that first interaction, and how do we build trust before we actually start helping them process? And helpful versus unhelpful action. This is really important to understand because, like I said before, my family tends to put a cape on me and call me Wonder Woman because of the work that I do. And that's cute. It's awesome. I feel powerful, but also, is that a character? Is that an energy that I'm constantly needing and constantly going for when I'm working with clients? No, absolutely not. We all know that. That's far from the truth. So we need to be aware of behaviors that are saving versus helping, if we're enabling or if we're empowering people, if we tend to make decisions for someone because it's easier for you, not necessarily for them, to get your checklist completed. If you're being more proactive than they are, and if you're just having that savior complex, which we all know I'm definitely not. I'm guilty of this as well. That I've had that in the past, and you will continue to have that. We do not want to watch people suffer. We don't want people in pain. We don't want people to experience the situations that they are experiencing. But at the same time of not wanting that to happen, it is happening, and there's nothing that you can do in that moment other than provide the services that they need. And to have this Justice League superhero amazing ability to just change things and rescue people from that it's maladaptive. It's not allowing that person autonomy. It's not allowing that person to work with their resources and their abilities to make themselves improve and grow and heal. Um, so, how are you allowing that person to come into your office and explain their story in a way that they're comfortable with, and also meeting their needs and assessing for safety? How are you establishing respect first and foremost? You should be establishing respect, trust, and support initially, right away off the bat. You should not be valuing completing your intake and finishing your checklist over these concepts. It's hard to just focus on the story and instead of concentrating on what you need to say or what you should be saying next, because unfortunately, sometimes it's pretty obvious when someone is telling you their story and you're actively thinking in your head about a safety plan, even though they are not ready for that and they never mentioned a safety plan. You are obviously computing the details and converting it into a safety plan as they're telling you their story. The gestures that you make, the facial expressions, the interaction that you have really tells a lot. So that's where that self-assessment comes into play, and you need to be self-aware, and you need to identify whether that person needs active listening for you to actually sit there and just lend an ear, or if you need more of an interaction, collaborative effort to educate them, if they need resources, if they need a safety plan, you need to identify that right away and do not impose that on that person. And helping versus rescuing. So rescuing looks like Justice League. You have the capacity to care and feel for another human being. You're being sensitive and you're truly affected by their story. And a good example of this that I thought of was those awful commercials where they're showing those poor little doggies in cages and they're like, please give money or help us to save these poor little animals. That's what I think of when I think of rescuing and sympathy. And it's there's a time and place for it, obviously, but for the most part, when we're working with these clients, that rescuing mentality, we're not empowering them. We're enabling, we're fixing, we're controlling the situation, we're protecting that person. And that's not necessarily what they need. We need to be having more of a helping energy. We need to identify the situation. We need to understand their feelings without enabling. We need to build that trust, and we need to be able to let them go and do it on their own because it's their life. We cannot enable them. When we don't allow them to do that, we're forming unhealthy attachment. We are creating that buffer between themselves and their situation, and that's a helping energy that is preventing them from being able to build their own lives back up. You don't want to be in the middle of that. So you need to understand that, like I said before, there's a balance. So people are going to come in with crisis. People are going to come in with a backtrack. They will not follow through on plans. They'll change plans. They'll take steps back. They're going to be making missteps instead of mistakes. And they're entitled to do that because we need to maintain that balance, right? So, really quickly, I got some really good resources from the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. There's a brand new toolkit, and it's called Tools for Transformation, and it's called Becoming Accessible, Culturally Responsive, and Trauma Informed. And this is a wonderful toolkit. I highly recommend it. I put the link on the bottom there. It is about 66 pages worth of it's gold. I love it. The language is really easy to learn. It's easy to incorporate. And I took a lot of that from that toolkit. So if we don't get to talk about a lot of this today, you can go ahead and go through that toolkit and let us know what you found. But mostly, the thing to take away here is the individual and the agency should work together, and you should be accessible. You should be culturally responsive, not culturally competent, and you should be trauma informed. So what does it mean to be accessible? You need to access services, and each person that accesses your services, they have the right to make individual choices about how they want their abilities and identities recognized and understood. You should not label that person for them. I personally have an issue, and this is just me. Everyone's different, but I have an issue with calling victims victims. I have an issue with calling victims survivors and vice versa. Some people don't identify with the victim survivor label. A lot of them choose something different, or they don't associate themselves with the stigma behind those labels, behind those identities. So it's important to I just straight up ask them what their identity, what they prefer, if there's pronouns involved, if there's things that I know as identities, if that's true for them, if they prefer to be referred to and recognized as something different. It's giving that person autonomy to identify their own being. So allow that person to explain if they're capable of what their identity is and how you should be understanding it. Not everyone's the same. There's different people within these communities. So you need to keep all of their identities intact. No one should feel like they have to change or hide parts of themselves in order to receive services. So in your intake process, are you asking pronouns? Are you asking identities? Are you asking backgrounds? Are you leaving stuff out? Are there categories that should be on there that aren't on there? Are you registering and communicating a wide spectrum of identity? In your language, in your model, in your mission statement, are you keeping individuals' identities intact? Are you making them feel comfortable that they can be and behave and speak and communicate with their whole entire being without the threat of not receiving your services or being treated differently? And their individual means and how they ask for help. So we need to be respectful and self-aware that we don't have biases attached to our thinking around why someone asks for help or when or how, right? Because every story is going to be different. And that's sometimes really hard when we've been in the field for a while and we see and hear a lot of different types of things. We tend to associate people with each other, even though there's similar stories, but they're completely different people. And that, again, is our tendency as humans to categorize things and make patterns of people and make patterns of things so that it's more predictable and it's more comfortable for us. But that's a maladaptive reflex that we have. So to be aware of that. And Ty's going to explain a little bit about considering using interpreters.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, this wouldn't be this webinar wouldn't be complete if I didn't talk a little bit about considerations when using interpreters, right? And we don't have a whole lot of time left. We've only got about 8 minutes, and I want to be mindful of your time, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. But individuals who have experienced domestic violence, sexual violence, or trafficking have to navigate complex legal systems. Imagine not understanding the laws to begin with, and then add not knowing how to communicate your questions and your needs. So individuals with limited English proficiency and individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing face those challenges plus many more challenges on top of that. As a service provider, we need to be considering and reevaluating our practices when it comes to language access policies. Having spoken and sign language interpretation by professional culturally aware interpreters, that is critical for equal access to safety and to justice. It's also important to inform the individual needing interpretation on the role of the interpreter and the code of professional conduct for interpreters to avoid any type of confusion. Like I said, I've been doing this work for over 2 decades, and I've used numerous different types of interpreters, whether it be over the phone, whether it be with a computer robot thing that hospitals used. It could be in person. I've used different types of interpreters, and every single one is confusing. And the people that we're serving, the people that we're working with, don't know what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, or the things that is happening, like they don't understand how that is being done. So just sitting down and talking with them first isn't really important to let them know that you're going to be using an interpreter and how that looks, and use the interpreter while you're doing that, but don't forget to go over that. And again, use only trained interpreters. So professional interpreters, they know their role. They know to only interpret what is being said and not to overstep. A professional interpreter will not engage in side conversations. They won't provide advice or comfort the victim. Um, it's also important to note that interpreters are also a part of that community. And because of their English speaking ability, individuals that they're interpreting for may want to go to that interpreter outside of the setting to ask questions or to seek advice. And I'm saying that because I used to be an interpreter and people would come to my house, knock on my door and ask me questions and ask me what they should do and all of that. And if you use a professional interpreter, that person would know to say, go back to the program, go back to the advocate, ask those questions, have them call me. I would interpret for you, but I can't answer that question for you. So trained interpreters will know to do that. And they'll know to direct the individual back to the service provider. And even if I knew the answer, I know that it wasn't my role to provide that answer. Okay. Um, Interpreting for individuals experiencing DV and SV is a lot more complex than just interpreting for other situations. And I'm saying that from my own experience. I used to be an interpreter for clinic settings. I interpreted for the schools. I interpreted for, just people wanting to get cell phone contracts, like people wanting to get driver's license, like all different types of situations. And I will 100% tell you that when I did interpreting for people who were experiencing domestic violence and sexual violence, who were navigating the legal system, that is way more complex. The issues and the things that I am interpreting are really, really personal. And the language and the vocabulary of DV and SV is completely different than the language that I would be using in everyday life. So always make sure that the interpreter that you're using, that they are experienced with the vocabulary and that they're comfortable interpreting in these situations. Because one time I had an interpreter that I had used, I was the advocate and I had called an interpreter in to interpret for a sexual assault. And the interpreter was not comfortable in providing that interpretation. And luckily, I sensed that the interpreter wasn't comfortable. I stopped it. I asked them if they were comfortable. And again, this is where my learning came in because now I'm telling you, ask first. Don't wait to notice that they're uncomfortable to do the asking because by then damage has already been done, right? Like I had to stop it. We had to, get somebody else in and all of that. Like if we do the homework beforehand, we can avoid a lot of this stuff. So um, some other things to think about is conflict of interest between the interpreter and the client. So this is a concern we should be thinking about ahead of time again. Oftentimes interpreters, they come from the same community and know the person that is in need of interpretation. And so this can cause the individual seeking services to not feel safe or comfortable to share the story. So whenever possible, let the individual know um, who will be interpreting. Give them the name, ask them if they're comfortable with that person, and before you use the person to interpret. And of course, obviously, don't use their children to interpret for them. 20 years ago, when I started doing advocacy, like I saw a lot of children doing interpretation. I say obviously now because I think we have progressed to obviously everybody knows now to not use children, right? But I still feel the need to throw that in there.
It's
Uh-huh.
really important.
Mhm. And confidentiality. The confidentiality is super important. Due to the sensitive topic of our work, confidentiality is a necessity to reiterate to the interpreter and the person seeking services. Just clear the air. Just say, everything is confidential. The interpreter had to sign an acknowledgement of confidentiality before they're even providing services. So you just want to make sure that people are feeling really comfortable in talking and in sharing all of these personal stories of these. And quickly, Maria, just give me like one more minute, but I want to acknowledge that suggestions that I got from the Asian Pacific Institute on gender-based violence, and I have that handout in the handout portion. So you guys will get a PowerPoint and also a handout. I've included that handout on considerations when using interpreters, and it's just some of those considerations are, the gender of the interpreter may affect the victim's comfort around the interpreter, the age difference between the interpreter and the victim to can affect the victim's comfort with disclosing domestic or sexual violence. And also when you are using an interpreter, be aware of the proximity of the interpreter to the individual that is seeking services. So people might not be comfortable sitting very close to another person. And a lot of times I know as an interpreter that you often usually sit behind the person you're interpreting for, or you sit next to the person that you're interpreting for. People in people who are experiencing DV and or sexual violence, they might not be comfortable with somebody sitting that close to them. So just being aware of that and mindful of that and keeping that in mind when you're using interpreters. I'm sorry, I tried to do it really fast.
That's impressive. Okay,
There's a whole
so
lot more, and we,
I
like I said, there's
know.
so much more we can talk to you all about as far as providing services for underserved populations, but we really want to know, this is really broad. What me and Maria have been talking about today is really broad, and we would love feedback from all of you about future topics that you want us to do presentations on, as far as working with underserved populations.
hmm And like I said, I'm not able to talk about the information that I got from the toolkit, but like I said, if you want to learn more about it, there is a link on that slide, but also in the references, and you can always email me and I can tell you exactly what pages I took the information from. And just to say, hey, I need to meet people. So send me an email if you need resources on that. But yeah, I think we can conclude our webinar.
All right, well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a nice rest of your day.